Genetics. Dun dun dun. Genetics. Dun dun dun. Just kidding. Genetics is pretty cool. So I'm excited to talk about genetics. This is Unit 4. Can you believe that we have this unit and one more unit? And you're done with me for first semester biology. So, pretty exciting, maybe for some of you guys. I'm a little bummed, but, that's okay. I'll get you guys for another semester. But let's get into Unit 4. We're going to do Section 1 tonight, or today, or whenever you're watching this. So we're going to dive deeper a little bit into genetics. We did touch on it in the cell structure unit, but let's go into it just a bit deeper. I like this picture that I found, because guys, I love to Google images. And it really encompasses a lot about what we're going to talk about in the next 2 weeks with genetics. We have, obviously, this DNA structure here, which basically where our genes are housed. And then you have all of these things are going to be a little in depth. You guys won't necessarily know, but ultimately phenotype and genotype, and just basically so many different components of genetics are found in this picture. So I'm not going to go over it in detail because you'll see as we go through. But it's kind of a cool picture. Come back to it and see if you can see, I get why this is here. All right, so to start us off, let's have a little video, shall we?
Your body is made up of 50 trillion cells. Cells come in many different varieties with many different functions. But inside almost every cell is a nucleus containing 99.9% of your genes and mitochondria containing a few more genes. All told, you have nearly 20,000 genes. Your genes are small parts of a long molecule called DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. If you lined up all of the DNA containing all of your genes, it would measure 6 feet long. But it's coiled so tightly that it fits in just one cell nucleus. DNA is a double-stranded molecule composed of sugar, phosphate, and 4 different bases: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. These bases spell out the language known as the genetic code. The number and order of these 4 bases determine, for example, whether you are a chimp, a cow, a banana, or a human. Most genes are recipes for making specific proteins. These recipes are passed down from parents to children, from generation to generation. When someone says, "You have your father's hair," what they mean is, you appear to have inherited a gene or genes from your father that makes a protein that instructs your hair follicle cells to produce hair that curls like your father's. But they usually opt for the shorter version. Genes tell a cell how to function and what traits to express. More specifically, gene regulators turn different genes on and off in different cells to control cell function. The long molecules of DNA containing your genes are organized into pieces called chromosomes. Different species have different numbers of chromosomes. Humans usually have 46 chromosomes, 2 sets of 23, or simply 23 pairs of chromosomes. Chimpanzees have 2 sets of 24, or 24 pairs of chromosomes. Rhesus monkeys have 21 pairs of chromosomes. Cows have 30 pairs of chromosomes. Chickens have 39 pairs, fruit flies have 4 pairs, and bananas have 11 pairs. So, what percentage of the DNA in your chromosomes do you share with other species? You share 93% of your DNA with the rhesus monkey and 98.5% with our friend chimpanzee. How about with other humans? 99.5%. So, what makes us different from one another? Well, for one thing, SNPs.
Alright, so there you have a little bit of tie-in with last unit. So it talked a little bit about the cell organelles, and in particular DNA, which we touched on in the cell structure. But we're going to dive deeper into DNA. Not necessarily in this section, but we'll talk about those base pairings, we'll talk about how DNA is replicated, and so forth. So hang tight, that'll come in about section 3. So there you go, a little bit of basic overview about some of the genetics we're going to talk about. But let's talk a little bit more about what it is in general, because sometimes you're like, I kind of know what it is, but really, do I? So genetics is the study of the patterns of inheritance. We all know what inheritance is. We inherit different things from our mom and from our dad, and the interesting thing is there are patterns involved with that. There's a rhyme and a reason to that. It's not just like, oh, I guess I just ended up with that because there's actually a reason behind it, okay? So it is the study of the patterns of inheritance, and a lot of you guys will find this really interesting. A lot of times this is what kind of gets people going about, I kind of like biology, this whole genetics thing. You get to learn about yourself, which is kind of cool. So let's watch another video. Love it. If it loads. Come on, load. That technology, I tell ya, man. Alright, well, this is a great video that I will post. As usual, sometimes stuff like this happens. But I will post this underneath this section because this is a really good overview of genetics, a little over our heads, well, over your heads for now, because it's going to talk about some stuff that you guys are going to be like, huh? That's kind of like really in depth. But I guarantee by the end of this unit, you can go back and watch that, which might be better that I post that. So go back and watch that video. First watch it when you're watching this section, but then go back and watch it after you're done with this whole unit and see how much more you can pick up on that. So, oh well, I guess that's technology. Let's move into the history of genetics. So the history of genetics really dates back to quite some time ago, but although really so many of the findings are still very, very new. So it all started with good old Watson and Crick. Let's kind of zoom in on that. Watson and Crick basically discovered DNA, and I'm not going to go into these in depth because you're going to read through in your lesson. It talks a lot more about the history. There's not a lot of information that needs to be explained. It's more just history. So I'll let you guys kind of go into that. But it's kind of cool to, you know, see where it started and also all of the findings we're still having. So Watson and Crick basically, and you guys are also going to have an assignment on him, on both of them. Sorry, it's two guys. One of the Watch This, Do This. So you'll learn more about them because they're the founders of DNA, which is pretty cool, pretty amazing. Can you imagine if you're like, yeah, so, I discovered DNA. It's pretty cool. And I'm like, yeah, I'm just Mrs. Howie and I teach science. Woohoo! So anyways, they're pretty cool. But also, this is just some random chick, but there's lots of geneticists out there that are finding some really cool information that even to this day, they're finding out new things. I did this awesome lab at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science where they're finding all these different things about how we taste and people that are called super tasters. So if you guys have been there, and actually next semester we'll take a field trip there, you'll see that there's a lab there where they paint people's tongues blue. So that's just one of the new kind of things that they're doing in the world of genetics, okay? So, some basic history. But also, when we talk about the history, it goes back to something very general. Boy meets girl. And you know the story, I don't have to go into the birds and the bees, but this is how offspring came to have traits from both parents. That's the history, the basis of genetics. Offspring basically have genes, okay? Obviously, everyone has genes within them, and you get those traits from each parent. How does that happen? This is what all we're talking about, genetics, okay? So that's a little bit more. Now, to go on to some big history, a guy by the name of good old Gregor Mendel, and you guys will hear that name quite often, especially when it comes to genetics. He is the father of genetics. There are so many different things that this guy did, and instead of you guys listening to me going blah, 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 how about if we hear from somebody who I really like, although in this video clip, he's not quite as goofy as usual. So let's hear from Bill Nye. He'll tell you a little bit more about Mendel, and then we'll move on.
In the middle of the 19th century, an Augustinian monk named Gregor Mendel took up the question of biological inheritance with a series of experiments. Mendel had a naturally inquisitive mind and a profound love of nature. His scientific interests ranged from research on plants to meteorology and the theories of evolution. Working at a monastery in what is now the Czech Republic, Mendel started by crossbreeding different strains of garden peas, then observing the characteristics of their offspring. Why choose peas? He did it, he said, for the fun of the thing. Mendel noticed that when he crossed a round pea seed with a wrinkled one, the offspring were round, not a mix of the two characteristics as he had expected. Yet when he bred the round pea offspring, that's where the mix appeared, and the second generation had both round and wrinkled seeds. He continued to experiment, trying to understand what kind of biological mechanism would cause certain characteristics to disappear in the first generation, only to reappear in the second. Then one day, Mendel counted the number of peas in the second generation that had the wrinkled characteristic. Exactly 1/4 of the peas were wrinkled. What Mendel observed in his experiments were the biological phenomena we now refer to as dominance and segregation, only Mendel didn't know it yet. Still, his experiments produced a curious set of facts which, as he said, forced themselves upon my notice. You see, no matter how he crossbred the various strains of peas, the hidden characteristics showed up, but only in 1/4 of the second generation. For Mendel, here was the breakthrough. For the first time, he could demonstrate that the traits of successive generations were inherited in certain numerical ratios. In other words, there were fixed laws of nature that governed heredity. With this insight, Mendel made the first great discovery in the science of genetics. Each inherited characteristic must be decided by a pair of what he called factors. Each parent, he said, contributes one factor for each characteristic. Certain factors are dominant and others recessive. Depending on the combination of the factors, the offspring inherits. Mendel's factors are called genes. The term Mendelian trait is used to describe a characteristic caused by a single gene that sometimes reappears in 1/4 of the offspring. That characteristic can be innocuous, such as freckles or the ability to curl your tongue. But it also can lead to serious illnesses like cystic fibrosis or Tay-Sachs disease. Imagine all that from one man's work with the humble pea.
So Mendel did a ton of work, and a ton of discoveries came from him studying these peas. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but I am going to conclude this part. That way you guys get little snippets. So we'll be back with the principle of segregation. Hold tight.